Well, Alice, that's not all. I have another surprise for you. Yes. Look who else has come to visit. Alice, I knew you were always a big fan of Dorothy Thompson, and even if you never expressed it. And here she is, Dorothy Thompson.
Oh, Dorothy, welcome.
Well, thank you so much. It's lovely to be here. And look at this place. Wow, when I lived here, we had the Opera House, but I guess that burned down.
Burned down and everything with it, all the way down to the corner of Center Street, and I rebuilt all of it. What do you think?
Well, I think this is lovely. Look at these doors. I love the comedy and tragedy. I love the chandeliers and those inset lights are gorgeous. Wow. It's going to be even more beautiful, I suppose. And about me. I was not quite 8 years old in the early 1900s when my mother died. We were living in the Hamburg Methodist manse at the time, and I remember distinctly I was in the backyard when my father came down and got me and took me upstairs to their bedroom and asked me to say goodbye. It was awful. My beautiful, loving, laughing mother. I would never talk about it with anybody after that. I just repressed the memory. My Aunt Lizzie, my father's older sister, came to live then, and she took over the household, which was nice for me because then I got to go on rides with my father when he went out to visit his parishioners in their farms, sometimes sick at home, sometimes in the hospital. On those occasionally long rides, we would talk about books and God and daily life. I absolutely adored my father. And this went along for a couple of years very nicely until suddenly I noticed that the organist, a single lady in her 40s, was eyeing my father with what seemed like a reprieve from spinsterhood for her. My father, my gentle, thoughtful father, thought perhaps a mother in the house would be better than an aunt, and he succumbed to her advances. I was the one with a scowl on my face in the wedding photo. Shortly after that, we were moved to about 20 miles south of Hamburg to Gowanda, where we took up residence in the Methodist manse on East Main Street next to Thatcher Brook. By this time, things had deteriorated even more between my stepmother and me. She was of the opinion that the Methodist minister's child should be ladylike and decorous, and I was an excellent student and I was a voracious reader, but I was also very active, sort of a tomboy, and I had some good friends who were of like mind. I had what I thought was a playful sense of humor, but which my stepmother termed deviltry. My friends and I were good students, but we had extracurricular activities in creative writing, which we shared with others. We had a professor named Professor Miller who hailed from Steuben, and he kept telling us that we were really fortunate to have him as a professor since he came from Steuben, and we would be even more fortunate if we ourselves had lived in Steuben. Part of what we wrote was, "We've heard so much about that place. Prof. Miller hails from there. I'm sure the grass is greener. I'm sure the sky's most fair. The people there are all so good, the children so sedate. They never plague their teachers, dear. They're never into scrapes. They sit and study all day long and never look around, or whisper, or eat chestnuts, or throw chalk, or make a sound." Unfortunately, as the poem was being passed around among the classmates, the giggles gave us away, and Professor Miller confiscated the copy. And the next thing Laura and I knew, we were in the headmaster's office being given a lecture on disrespect and frivolity. Then he suspended us for a week. I thought this was a terrible overreaction, but stepmother did not concur. So then there were whispered conversations in the evening and letters that went back and forth to and from Chicago. And the next thing I was being told that I was going to Chicago to live with my father's sisters, whom I called Aunt, and auntie to distinguish between them. I said a sad goodbye to my good friends in Gowanda, and off I went to Chicago. My aunts then bought me the pretty nice new clothes I had never before had. They took me to a hair salon and had my hair styled, and then they repeatedly told me how pretty I was. I had never been told I was pretty. I had heard adults say in my hearing, that preacher's daughter was really smart, but nobody ever said I was pretty. They enrolled me in a private school called Lewis Institute, which had not only high school, but also 2 years of college courses, and I loved it. The professors were intelligent, engaging, challenging, all the things that a teacher should be, and they liked children too. I got very good marks, except in mathematics. And I joined the debating team, where it turns out I had something of a gift for public speaking. When I finished, in fact, one time I went home on a holiday visit to Western New York, now Spencerport, and my father got sick on the weekend, and I gave the Sunday sermon at church. When I finished schooling at Lewis, I wanted to go to Bryn Mawr or Smith or Vassar or one of those highfalutin women's colleges, but too expensive. So I ended up in Syracuse, where as a Methodist minister's daughter, I could go for $120 a year in tuition. I liked Syracuse. In fact, in 1937, years later, they invited me back to speak at the commencement and conferred an honorary degree on me, and it felt like a homecoming to me to go back to Syracuse. I was invited later to be commencement speaker at other universities, including Columbia in New York City, but I digress. I graduated from Syracuse in 1914 at age 21, and I wanted to be a writer, but I had absolutely no idea how to go about starting a career in writing. And instead, I ended up back in Buffalo, where my father was now in the city as a minister, and took a job working in an office where they were lobbying for the suffrage vote. And first I just stuffed envelopes, but when they discovered that I was not afraid to stand up in front of people and talk, they sent me out on the stump, and I developed my stump speech and went from little community to little community to little community, lobbying for the right for women to vote. Eventually, of course, New York State did vote that in, and at that time, my best friend and I, Barbara LaPorte, went on to New York City in the hopes of starting these writing careers that we both wanted. Barbara, we should have been polar opposites. I was the poor child of a Methodist minister, and she was from a wealthy immigrant Russian family of Sephardic Jews. I had never met a Jew in my life. But we were instant close friends. And after a long time, sometime in New York, where we managed to keep body and soul together, writing little pieces for news sheets and magazines, we decided we were going to head to Europe. This was 1917, and very exciting things were happening in Europe for journalists. Looking back, it seems that I was often in the right place at the right time. On the ship going over to London, there were a group of Zionist Jews going to a conference there. And through Barbara, I was introduced to them and talked at length with many, including Chaim Weizmann, who was the leader of the Zionist movement. I had voluminous notes, which when I got to England, I parlayed into a paid assignment covering their conference. When I finished that, I went on to Ireland because I was supposed to be looking up some relatives there. And lo and behold, I somehow met Terence McSweeney, who was the leader of Sinn Féin. And I interviewed him at considerable length also, just weeks before he went on a hunger strike, of which he died in prison. And I had the last interview with him, which again, I was well paid for. I was now 27, independent, reasonably successful, starting to be well known, but single. And all of a sudden, into my life walked Joseph Bard, the son of a Jewish man and a Croatian woman, very European, very intelligent, strikingly handsome, and a wonderful companion. Did I mention he was really good looking? spent huge amounts of time together from then on, and about 2 years later we married. But 2 busy careers. He was also a writer, and I was still running from assignment to assignment when any crisis was mentioned on the tapes. And it didn't work, and we eventually divorced. Dealing with the breakup of my marriage, I worked harder, and I partied more. At one such reception at the German embassy, at the German, not embassy, a German something or another, I was in Berlin at the time. I was introduced to that wonderful American writer, Sinclair Lewis. Sinclair Lewis was not good looking, but he was wonderfully entertaining. He was a great mimic and entertained all parties with imitations of other people and accents and so forth. My good friend at the time, Dorothy Thompson, told me that he was a drunk, an out-and-out drunk, and was often at parties under the table talking to himself, drunk. And nobody seemed to think he was going to put himself in a rehab center to recover from alcoholism, but he insisted he wanted to marry me. And in fact, shortly after I met him, I invited him to my combination birthday divorce party, and he came, was not very friendly, but after everybody else left, he stayed, and at 3 o'clock in the morning, 3 a.m. in the morning, he asked me to marry him. I laughed. I don't even know you. No, but he wanted to marry me. Well, he went off. But for the next several weeks, he followed me everywhere. Every time I turned around, there he was asking me to marry him. In fact, there was another event, a dinner, where he was the guest of honor. The host introduced him and asked him if he'd like to say a few words, and he stood up and said, "Dorothy, will you marry me?" He said that if I would marry him and go back to the States, he would give up the alcohol. So I did. And we went back to Vermont and bought a beautiful piece of property in Vermont that had 2 farmhouses on it. We called it Twin Farms. And there we set up our life and entertained all our artistic and literary friends in those farmhouses. And we had a baby there named Michael, the love of my life. He grew up on Twin Farms. But we couldn't make it again. It was just too much, 2 careers again, and his alcoholism got worse and worse. And eventually, he convinced me that it was just not fair to our son to see us behaving the way we were and living the way we were. And so we got divorced. Once again, I immersed myself in work, writing a 3 times weekly column for the Ladies' Home Journal and going on radio broadcasts. Now, these were no longer news items, but my opinions, my telling people how I thought they should believe and think. And sometimes those views were controversial. But I it was wartime, and I also organized some work in Vermont where all the men had gone off to work and the women were at home on the farms. So I got college kids to come and work on the farms to help out, and I used our Twin Farms as headquarters for that. Sometime in there, somebody wanted to have a painting done of me, and a painter, poor, talented but poor painter was sent out, Maxim Kopf. And I didn't think I had time to sit for a painting, but he was there for the assignment, so I sat and I fell in love with him. And he was the man I should have married all along. We were married for 16 years and had a wonderful, happy life. We both traveled. I was still on assignment and he was painting, but we reserved the months from May to October as our time at Twin Farms together. We had just moved into a newly renovated house on the farm when he suffered 2 heart attacks in quick succession and died in the Hanover, New Hampshire hospital in 1958. I lived for 3 more years and died in Lisbon, Portugal in 1961, still traveling. I look back over all the years now and at the many honors and awards that I received in the course of my career. I was the first female foreign bureau chief for an American publication, giving me an opportunity to interview a young Adolf Hitler and write a successful book about him. I earned a substantial living as a public speaker upon returning from Europe to the States. But I think I am most pleased about the Time cover and cover story in 1939. Time called the cover, the press, Cartwheel Girl, based on an incident they had somehow uncovered that occurred way back when I lived in Gowanda. My unlovable stepmother used to make the three of us children clean up and come into the parlor to greet visitors. One time, on some whim, I stepped inside the door and did a perfect cartwheel, thus exposing my panties to 6 Methodist women. And I repeated that every once in a while. The Times story went on to say that though I would never be the first female U.S. president, Eleanor Roosevelt and I were undoubtedly the 2 most influential women in the United States. Can you imagine? And all this started because I had a horrible 3 years in Gowanda, got suspended from Gowanda school, and then sent off to Chicago. I remember moments when I was quite a child, walking up to the top of the highest hill surrounding Gowanda, so that I should see the wide world, thinking of the glorious things that I should do, and the wonderful things I should see when I grow up. And oh, I did.
Not only did I read your articles, but we always listen to your radio broadcast also. That is very interesting.
I enjoyed it as well, even though I didn't always agree with some of the positions that you espoused. It was enjoyable. It was enjoyable. Thank you, ladies. Thank you very much, Dorothy, and thank you very much, Louise, for being special guests for Alice and for our special guests as well. And now, for all of you, I'd like to invite you to come down into the bowl of our theater so that I may tell you more about how this place came to be.